A piece of paper survives. It is yellowed now, foxed at the edges, the ink faded to a colour somewhere between brown and the memory of blue. It sits inside an acid-free folder in a climate-controlled vault at the Library of Congress, one leaf among thousands. But this one carries a weight the others do not. This is the last letter George Smith Patton Jr. writes to his eldest daughter. He composes it in early December 1945 from his headquarters in Heidelberg, a city whose medieval bones are still visible beneath the scaffolding of Allied occupation. The war in Europe has been over for 7 months. Patton is 60 years old. He is restless, diminished in command, politically disgraced, and ready to come home. The letter is not long. It carries the rhythms of a man who has been writing to this particular reader for 4 decades. First as the scrawling father addressing a child on an army post, later as the general sending dispatches from North Africa and Sicily and France, always with that strange mixture of bravado and tenderness that only people who knew him in private ever witnessed. In these final days, the bravado's quieter. What comes through instead is a kind of weariness dressed in plans. He speaks of homecoming. He speaks of what he will do when he is back. And then, almost as an afterthought, he writes a line that will haunt the woman who receives it. I may see you before you see this. It is the kind of sentence a man writes when he believes he is racing his own mail across the Atlantic. It is also, in retrospect, the kind of sentence that sounds like a ghost speaking. Beatrice Patton. Waters receives this letter after her father is already dead. She keeps it. She keeps everything. For the rest of her life, which will not be as long as anyone expects, she will maintain custody of his papers, his diaries, his private correspondence, the raw, unvarnished record of a man the public knows only through newsreels and headlines. She becomes the archivist, the gatekeeper, the daughter who decides what the world is allowed to see and what remains locked away. And locked away, for decades, is the family's private version of what happened on a road outside Mannheim on the morning of December 9th, 1945. The version that never quite matches the official account. The version that carries questions no one in uniform ever satisfactorily answers. What did Beatrice Patton Waters know? What did she protect? And why did she guard certain truths with a ferocity that outlasted her own life? The answers begin with that letter, and with the 9 seconds that followed its writing. 9 seconds on a straight road in occupied Germany that ended the life of the most feared American general of the Second World War, and began a silence that has never fully broken. Heidelberg in December 1945 is a city that smells of coal smoke and wet plaster. The castle on the hill above the Neckar River is intact. The Allies spared it, one of the few German cities they chose not to bomb into rubble, and its sandstone walls glow a dull amber in the thin winter light. Below it, in the buildings requisitioned for the American occupation forces, staff officers shuffle between offices that still bear the ghosts of their previous tenants. Filing cabinets with German labels, typewriters with umlauts on their keys, the detritus of a regime swept aside and replaced with another bureaucracy, this one speaking English and drinking coffee from tin cups. Patton's headquarters occupy a suite of rooms in one of these commandeered buildings. He is, by this point, commanding the 15th Army, a paper organisation tasked with writing the official history of the European theatre. It is a job for clerks, not for the man who drove the Third Army across France in a campaign that military historians will study for the next century. He knows this. Everyone around him knows this. The assignment is a demotion dressed in the language of honour, handed to him after his public statements about denazification and his open contempt for Soviet allies made him politically radioactive. Eisenhower, once his champion, has moved him aside with the gentleness of a man putting down a difficult horse. Patton writes letters in these final days. He writes to his wife, Beatrice Patton, back in Massachusetts. He writes to friends, to former staff, to his daughters. The letters from this period carry a tone that biographers have described as resigned, even melancholic. A man who senses that his usefulness is over, that the world he was built to operate in has closed its doors. He speaks of retirement. He speaks of returning to the family estate at Green Meadows. He speaks of sailing, of horses, of the life that waits on the other side of the Atlantic. But beneath the domestic planning, something else moves. Patton has always been a man who believes in fate, in reincarnation, in the mystical pull of destiny. He has written poetry about past lives on ancient battlefields. He has stood on ground in France and claimed to remember fighting there in other centuries, in other bodies. Now, in December 1945, that sense of cosmic certainty seems to have turned inward. He is not afraid. He has never been afraid. But he is aware, in the way that men of enormous vitality sometimes become aware, that the story is ending, that what comes next will not be written by him but about him. The letter to Beatrice carries that awareness. It carries plans for Christmas. It carries the offhand intimacy of a father who has been absent for most of his daughter's adult life, and now imagines himself present again. And it carries that single line, "I may see you before you see this," that assumes the future will cooperate, that assumes the road between here and home is open and safe. The road, of course, is not safe. The road is never safe. And in 3 days, on a stretch of highway between Mannheim and the town of Speyer, the road will take everything. December 9th, 1945, a Sunday morning. The air over the Rhine plain is cold and damp, the sky a flat iron grey that offers no shadows. General Patton is in the back seat of his staff car, a 1938 Cadillac Model 75, heavy and long, the kind of vehicle that announces its passengers' rank by its sheer mass. The car belongs to a world already vanishing, a pre-war machine pressed into service for a post-war general. Its rear compartment is separated from the front by a glass partition set in a metal frame, a luxury feature of civilian design, never intended for combat zones, never stress-tested against the physics of collision. Patton is not alone. Beside him sits Major General Hobart Gay, Hap to everyone who knows him, his chief of staff, a man who's been at his side through the campaigns in North Africa and Europe. Up front, behind the wheel, Private First Class Horace L. Woodring guides the Cadillac along a road that runs roughly northeast, toward a pheasant hunt that Patton has planned as a final recreation before his departure for the United States. The time is approximately 11:45 in the morning. They are near the outskirts of Mannheim, approaching an intersection. The road is straight. Traffic is light. The sparse movement of military vehicles that characterizes occupied Germany in this period. There is nothing remarkable about the morning. There is nothing that announces what is about to happen. And then a truck appears. It is a 2.5-ton US Army truck, the ubiquitous deuce and a half that has hauled supplies across every theatre of the war. Technical Sergeant Robert L. Thompson is at the wheel. The truck is turning left, crossing the Cadillac's lane to enter a quartermaster depot. The geometry is simple. The truck sweeps across the road at a perpendicular angle directly into the path of the oncoming staff car. Woodring brakes. The Cadillac is not travelling fast. Estimates place its speed between 20 and 30 miles per hour. The truck is barely moving, executing its turn at the crawl of a heavy vehicle negotiating an intersection. The collision, when it comes, is not the catastrophic impact of high-speed accident. It is a low-velocity meeting of metal and metal, the kind of fender-level collision that, in civilian life, results in insurance claims and irritated drivers. No airbags exist in 1945, no crumple zones, but the forces involved should not kill anyone. They do not kill anyone in the front seat. Woodring is shaken but uninjured. Gay, beside Patton in the rear, walks away without a scratch. The truck driver, Thompson, is unhurt. Of the 4 men involved in this collision, only one suffers injury. Patton is thrown forward. His head strikes the metal frame of that glass partition, the divider between the driver's compartment and the passenger compartment, and in the fraction of a second that his skull meets that frame, the 3rd and 4th cervical vertebrae shatter. The spinal cord is damaged. George S. Patton Jr., who has survived 2 world wars, who has driven tanks through minefields, who has stood in open turrets under artillery fire, is paralysed from the neck down by a crash that barely dents the Cadillac's fender. 9 seconds, perhaps fewer. From the moment the truck enters the Cadillac's lane to the moment Patton's body comes to rest against the partition, the entire event occupies less time than it takes to draw a full breath. 9 seconds to transform the most aggressive American commander of the 20th century into a man who cannot move his own fingers. He is conscious. He is aware. In the back seat, unable to feel anything below his neck, Patton speaks. He asks Gay to rub his hands, to work his fingers. "Go ahead, Hap. Work my fingers," as though the paralysis might be temporary, as though circulation alone might restore what the shattered vertebrae have taken. And then, with the dark clarity that has always characterized his self-awareness, he says it. What a hell of a way to die. Not what a hell of a way to be injured. To die. He knows. In that first minute, before the ambulance arrives, before the doctors at the 130th Station Hospital in Heidelberg begin their 12-day vigil, Patton already knows what this is. There is a detail that survives from earlier that same morning, before the crash, before the intersection, before the truck. As the Cadillac passed along the road, Patton observed the wreckage of military vehicles, burned-out hulks left over from the war, rusting in the fields alongside the highway. He remarked to Gay, "How awful war is! Think of the waste." It is an uncharacteristic statement from a man famous for his love of combat, his almost erotic relationship with the machinery of violence. It sounds, in retrospect, like a man who has already crossed some invisible threshold, who is looking at destruction with the eyes of someone no longer inside it but above it, observing from a distance that war could never reach while he was young. The crash itself will generate an official accident report. That report will subsequently disappear. No copy has ever been located in military archives. The investigation that follows is cursory, closed quickly, its conclusions never formally published in a manner that satisfies the questions the crash raises. Why was Patton the only one injured? How does a low-speed collision produce a cervical fracture of that severity in a rear-seat passenger while leaving the man beside him untouched? What exactly was the position of the vehicles at impact? What happened to Thompson, the truck driver, afterward? Where did he go? Why was he never publicly interviewed? Why did his name vanish from the record? These are the questions that will follow the crash for decades. They are the questions the family will carry in private. They are the questions Beatrice Patton Waters will inherit along with the papers and the diaries, questions she will neither answer publicly nor allow to die. But before the questions, before the silence, before the archive, there is the woman herself, and to understand what she guards and why, it is necessary to understand who she was before December 9th, 1945 made her the keeper of her father's last mystery. Beatrice Eyre Patton Waters is born in 1911, not 1903, as some secondary sources erroneously report, the first child of George and Beatrice Eyre Patton. She arrives into a world that is already structured by the rhythms of military life, the transfers, the temporary housing, the constant motion from post to post that ensures an army child has no single hometown, but rather a constellation of places half remembered. Fort Sheridan, Fort Myer, the family estate at Green Meadows in Massachusetts, where her mother's money, the Eyre textile fortune, provides a stability that army pay never could. She is called Little B within the family to distinguish her from her mother, Big B. The nickname carries into adulthood, though the woman it describes is anything but small. She is, by all accounts, her father's daughter in temperament, confident, direct, possessed of a physical vitality that matches his own. She rides, she sails, she moves through the social world of army families with the ease of someone born to it, which she is. But she's also her mother's daughter, and her mother is a woman of fierce intellectual discipline and emotional privacy. Beatrice Eyre Patton, the general's wife, is the one who manages the household, who maintains the family's social position, who absorbs the long absences and the public controversies and the endless letters without ever breaking the surface of composure that army wives are expected to maintain. This is the model young Beatrice grows up watching. This is the architecture of silence and loyalty she inherits. On June 27, 1934, Beatrice marries Lieutenant John Knight Waters, a West Point graduate and career army officer. The marriage is precisely the kind her world expects, the soldier's daughter marrying the soldier, and for a time, it follows the expected pattern. Posts, assignments, the slow peacetime grind of an army career between the wars. Waters is competent, well regarded, a man whose quiet professionalism contrasts with his father-in-law's volcanic flamboyance. They are, by the standards of their class and time, a model couple. Then the war comes, and the model shatters. By early 1943, Johnny Waters is in North Africa, commanding a tank battalion, under conditions that test every officer the army has sent to that theatre. The American forces are green, their equipment is outmatched. The Desert War is being won by Rommel's veterans, and the learning curve for the US Army is measured in blood. On February 14th, at the Battle of Sidi Bou Zid, 2 days before the more famous disaster at Kasserine Pass, Waters' unit is overwhelmed. He is captured by German forces. For Beatrice, the telegram arrives like a blade. Her husband is a prisoner of war. He is alive, that much the Red Cross confirms, but he is somewhere inside the German camp system, beyond reach, beyond rescue, beyond anything she can control. She is 23 years old. She has a father commanding an army in the same theatre where her husband has just vanished, and she must wait. The waiting lasts more than 2 years. Waters is moved through the German prisoner of war system, eventually arriving at Auflagsrichtlinie B, a camp for Allied officers located near the town of Hammelburg in Bavaria. He's treated according to the Geneva Conventions. Not well, but alive. Beatrice receives his letters through the Red Cross, brief and censored, saying nothing and everything. She writes back. The correspondence is a lifeline stretched thin across enemy territory, and all the while her father wages his war. North Africa, Sicily, the invasion of France, the race across Europe. Patton becomes, in these years, the most famous and most controversial American general, slapping soldiers in hospitals, making inflammatory speeches, driving his men at a pace that terrifies his superiors and electrifies the public. He is a figure of such outsized personality that the man inside, the father, the husband, the letter writer, becomes invisible behind the legend. But the man inside knows where his son-in-law is. He knows which camp. He knows the location. And as the Third Army pushes deep into Germany in the spring of 1945, closing on Bavaria, closing on Hammelburg, George Patton makes a decision that will stain his legacy and bind his daughter's private life to his public one in a knot that can never be untied. He authorises Task Force Bomb. That story belongs to a later chapter. For now, what matters is this. By the time the war ends, Beatrice Patton Waters is no longer simply the general's daughter. She is the woman whose husband's captivity became entangled in her father's most questionable command decision. She is the woman who knows, because she lived it, that the distance between Patton the public hero and Patton the private man is not a gap, but a chasm. She knows what he risked for her. She knows what it cost. And she knows that the official version of events, the version that appears in newspapers and after-action reports, is not the whole truth. This knowledge shapes her. It makes her vigilant. It teaches her that the family story and the public story are two different documents, and that someone must stand guard at the border between them. Her sister, Ruth Ellen Patton Totten, will say of her years later, "Ma is a tale that has never been told." The nickname, Ma, suggests something maternal, something soft. But the tale that has never been told is not soft. It is the tale of a woman who understood, from her 20s onward, that history would try to consume her family, and that the only defence against consumption was control. Control of the papers, control of the narrative, control of access. She marries this instinct to a discipline inherited from both parents, her father's ferocity, her mother's composure, and when the moment comes, when December 9th delivers its 9 seconds of catastrophe, and her father begins the 12-day process of dying in a hospital in Heidelberg, Beatrice is already prepared. Not emotionally, no one is prepared for that, but structurally. She knows that what follows a great man's death is not grief alone, but a battle over memory, over meaning, over who gets to say what happened and why. The papers will come to her, the diaries, those extraordinary private documents in which Patton recorded his unfiltered thoughts about colleagues, campaigns, politics and enemies, will pass into her custody. The letters, including that final one from Heidelberg with its ghostly line about seeing her before she sees the page, will remain in her hands. And with them will come the family's private account of the crash, the questions they asked that were never answered, the details that did not add up, the silence from official channels that grew louder the more you listened to it. She will hold all of this. She will hold it through the late 1940s, through the early 50s, through the years when the memory of the war is still raw, and no one wants to hear that something might be wrong with the story of how George Patton died. She will hold it past the point where holding it costs her nothing, into the territory where holding it becomes a choice, a daily deliberate decision not to speak, not to publish, not to answer the questions that researchers and journalists begin to bring to her door. What sustains that silence? Loyalty, certainly, discipline without question, but perhaps something else as well, something darker and more complicated. Perhaps the knowledge that the truth, whatever it is, will not bring him back. Perhaps the understanding that some truths, once released, cannot be controlled. Perhaps the fear that the world, given the full record, will not treat the man she loved as carefully as she has. Or perhaps, and this is the possibility that haunts the entire story, she guards the papers because what they contain is not merely embarrassing or inconvenient but genuinely dangerous. Because the questions about December 9th, 1945 are not paranoid fantasy, but the logical conclusions of a woman who was there, who knew the players, who understood the politics of that moment in ways that outsiders never could. The letter from Heidelberg sits in its acid-free folder. The ink is fading. The paper is fragile. But the questions it represents, the questions about what happened after it was written, about who was responsible, about what the family knew and when they knew it, those questions have not faded at all. They are as vivid now as they were on the day Beatrice Patton Waters first held that page in her hands and understood that her father was not coming home, that the future he described in his careful script would never arrive, and that the 9 seconds on the Mannheim road had given her a burden she would carry for the rest of her life. She carries it still. Somewhere in the archive, between the lines of his last words to her, the story waits. The 130th Station Hospital occupies a former German military barracks on the outskirts of Heidelberg, a solid, unremarkable building with high ceilings and tall windows that let in the pale December light of the Neckar Valley. On the evening of December the 9th, 1945, orderlies wheel George Patton into a private room on the upper floor. His neck is immobilized. His body, from the shoulders down, is inert. His mind is ferociously, mercilessly awake. He knows. From the instant of impact, he has known. In the back seat of the Cadillac, feeling nothing below the point where his forehead struck the partition, he spoke to Hobart Gay with the clinical detachment of a man who has studied wounds his entire adult life. "Go ahead, Hap, work my fingers." Gay took the general's hand and manipulated the digits. Patton could not feel it, could not feel anything. He understood then, with the speed and clarity that had always characterized his tactical mind, that the injury was catastrophic, that the war he had spent 4 decades training for had ended not with a bullet on a battlefield, but with a low-speed collision on a peacetime road, and that the body which had carried him through North Africa, Sicily, France and Germany was now a prison from which there would be no escape. For 12 days he inhabits that prison. 12 days in which the outside world receives only the barest medical bulletins, fractured cervical vertebrae, paralysis, stable but guarded condition, while inside the room, behind closed doors, Patton talks. He talks to Gay, who visits daily. He talks to the medical staff. He talks when she arrives after a grueling transatlantic journey to his wife. And what he says in those private hours constitutes a narrative, fragmentary, emotional, sometimes contradictory, but unmistakably a narrative, that diverges in emphasis and implication from the tidy accident story the army's already assembling downstairs. He remembers the truck. He remembers the moment of turning, the sudden apparition of the 2.5-ton GMC swinging left across the road, the inadequate distance, the impossibility of stopping. He remembers the sound. What he says about intent, about whether the collision felt accidental or deliberate in those conversations, remains within the family. But the texture of his frustration is unmistakable to everyone who enters the room. This is not only a man processing a catastrophic injury. This is a man who has spent 7 months watching his enemies, political enemies, bureaucratic enemies, ideological enemies within his own army, dismantle everything he built, strip him of command, humiliate him in the press, and reduce him from the conqueror of the Third Reich to the administrator of a paper-shuffling headquarters in Bavaria. And now, in the final act, his body has been taken from him, on a road outside Mannheim, under circumstances so banal, so improbable, so conveniently timed that the questions all but ask themselves. He does not, by most accounts, say, "I was assassinated." He is too precise a thinker for that, too aware of the difference between what he suspects and what he can prove. But he says enough. He says enough to plant a seed in the mind of every family member who hears him, a seed that will grow in the decades after his death into a quiet, persistent, unshakable doubt about the official version of events. Beatrice Patton, his wife, not yet the daughter who will inherit the papers, sits beside him through those days. She holds his hand, which cannot feel her touch. She reads to him. She listens. And she absorbs what he tells her with the steady composure of a woman who has spent 30 years married to a man the world considers volatile, and who she knows to be, in private, deeply rational. If George says something does not add up, Beatrice trusts that assessment. She has earned that trust through decades of partnership. She's not credulous. She's not conspiratorial. But she's also not naive, and she understands, perhaps better than anyone alive, the political landscape her husband was navigating in the autumn of 1945. The enemies he'd made, the things he had said publicly that powerful men wanted unsaid. The diary entries that, if published, would embarrass not merely colleagues but an entire administration. She understands that her husband had become, in those final months, inconvenient. And inconvenient men, in the wreckage of a world war, sometimes meet improbable ends. This is a hell of a way to die. The line survives in multiple accounts, spoken to staff, to family, to the walls of that high-ceilinged room. It carries his characteristic bluntness, his dark humour, his refusal to soften reality with euphemism. But it also carries something else, a bitterness, a sense of injustice. The man who rode into Messina and liberated Bastogne and crossed the Rhine before Montgomery could claim credit, that man is dying in a hospital bed because a truck turned left at the wrong moment on a road in occupied Germany, and nothing about the geometry of that sentence satisfies him. He dies at 5:55 in the evening on December 21st, 1945. 12 days. The length of a siege. The length of a final campaign waged entirely within the confines of a body that would not obey and a mind that would not stop. When it is over, when the breath stops and the extraordinary will that animated George Smith Patton Jr. finally releases its grip, his wife is beside him, and his daughter, thousands of miles away, already holds the letter he sent before the crash. Already carries, without yet knowing it, the weight of what those 12 days produced. Not merely grief, but a counter-narrative, a family story, a set of questions that the army has no interest in answering, and that she will spend the rest of her life deciding whether to ask aloud. The burial happens quickly. Too quickly, some will later say, for a 4-star general who liberated more of Europe than any other American commander. The decision is Luxembourg, the American military cemetery at Ham, where thousands of Third Army soldiers already lie in rows of white crosses beneath the gentle hills east of the city. The reasoning, as it reaches the public, is sentimental and fitting. Patton himself wished to rest among his men. He said so, reportedly, in life. And what widow would deny her husband's final wish? But the decision is more complicated than that. Beatrice Eyre Patton does consider a stateside burial. She weighs bringing him home, to Massachusetts, to the Patton family plots, to American soil where her children and grandchildren could visit. She's persuaded otherwise. Persuaded that his legacy demands the grand gesture of lying with his troops. Persuaded, perhaps, by others who understand that a burial in Luxembourg means a burial controlled by the army. The ceremony, the site, the access, the story of why he rests there, all shaped by the institution rather than by the family. It is a decision that serves the mythology. It does not serve the widow. And though she accedes to it, though she allows the symbolism to override her private need, the cost of that accession registers. She has given them his body. She will not give them the papers. Meanwhile, the Army's official account of the crash solidifies with remarkable speed and equally remarkable thinness. The preliminary report, compiled by the 818th Military Police Company and signed by First Lieutenant Peter Babalas, concludes that the accident resulted from carelessness on the part of both drivers. Patton's private first-class Horace Woodring and the truck's technician 5th grade Robert L. Thompson. Carelessness. The word does a great deal of work. It acknowledges fault without assigning blame. It explains without explaining. It closes a door. No formal board of investigation is convened. In the case of a 4-star general, a man whose death makes headlines in every allied nation, the United States Army does not convene a formal board of investigation. No criminal charges are filed. Thompson is cleared of wrongdoing within days. Days. The speed of that exoneration is itself a kind of statement. It says, this matter is settled. This matter is not interesting. This matter does not require further inquiry. Move on. And the original accident report, the primary document, the one piece of paper that should anchor any future investigation, disappears, not immediately, not theatrically. It simply ceases to be findable in the places where military records are stored. A document goes missing. It happens. Archives are imperfect, especially in the chaos of post-war occupation. But it happens to this particular document, at this particular time, concerning this particular death. And for a woman like Beatrice Patton, a woman who grew up inside the military bureaucracy, who understands exactly how records are kept and how unusual their disappearance is, the absence speaks as loudly as any presence could. She does not, by all evidence, become a conspiracy theorist. She does not rage publicly or hire investigators or write accusatory letters to the War Department. In later years, when the murder theories begin to circulate, when books appear claiming Soviet involvement, OSS plots, deliberate assassination, Beatrice is reportedly irritated by them. She maintains her belief in the official account, or at least she maintains the appearance of that belief, which is not precisely the same thing. What she carries privately, what she communicates to her children in the language of family, a raised eyebrow, a careful silence, a question left hanging in the air, that is another matter. The official position is one thing, the family posture is something else, and the family posture is shaped by those 12 days in Heidelberg, by what George said in that room, by the speed of the army's conclusions, by the vanishing paperwork, by the burial that happened far from home. The family posture is shaped by the cumulative weight of small wrongnesses, none conclusive, none provable, but together forming a pattern that a careful, intelligent woman cannot ignore. This is what Beatrice Waters inherits. Not merely the papers, but the posture. Not merely the archive, but the attitude toward official narratives that her mother modelled for 8 years between the general's death and her own. 8 years in which Beatrice Patton transcribes diaries, oversees the publication of War as I Knew It in 1947, manages the general's literary estate, and makes hundreds of quiet decisions about what to share and what to withhold. 8 years in which the eldest daughter watches her mother perform the work of curation, learning, whether consciously or not, how the labour is done. How you hold the line between history and privacy. How you feed the public just enough to satisfy its appetite without surrendering the parts that belong to the family alone. Then, on September 30th, 1953, Beatrice Patton goes riding in Hamilton, Massachusetts, the town north of Boston where the family keeps horses, where the landscape of stone walls and autumn maples is the landscape of her entire adult life. And something ruptures. An aortic aneurysm. She dies from the fall, or from the rupture, or from both at once. She's 67 years old. She has outlived her husband by nearly 8 years, and in those 8 years she has built, around the Patton archive, a structure of control so thorough that its transfer to the next generation feels less like inheritance and more like commissioning. She has not merely kept the papers. She has established the terms on which they may be accessed. She has created, by her own discipline and discretion, a model for how a Patton gatekeeper behaves. The archive passes to the 3 children. George S. Patton IV, himself an army officer, himself a man who will reach the rank of Major General, takes a portion. Ruth Ellen Patton. Totten receives her share. But the primary custodianship, the central responsibility, falls to the eldest, to Beatrice, to the woman who received the last letter, who married the prisoner, who understood, long before her mother's death made it official, that she was the one built for this work. What she inherits is vast. It is also dangerous. The wartime diaries alone, those day-by-day records Patton kept from North Africa through the final advance into Czechoslovakia, contain enough incendiary material to fuel a dozen scandals. Patton's assessments of Eisenhower, his opinions of Montgomery, his views on the Russians, on occupation policy, on denazification, on the political future of Europe. His language, in private, is unrestrained in ways that his public persona only hinted at. He names names, he assigns blame, he predicts, with alarming accuracy and alarming venom, futures that powerful men would prefer remain unspoken. The diaries are a weapon. In the wrong hands, or even in the right hands at the wrong moment, they could reshape the historical narrative of the entire European theatre. And alongside the diaries sit the personal letters, decades of correspondence between George and Beatrice Patton. Letters that reveal not the warrior, but the husband, the father, the private man with his doubts, his tenderness, his grandiosity, his dark moods. Letters that contain, amid the love and the strategy and the gossip, references to the crash, references to what he suspected, references perhaps to things he never said aloud in that hospital room but committed to paper in the weeks before December 9th, when he was already sensing that his enemies were closing in. Beatrice Waters inventories it all. She and her brother spend months, painstaking, tedious months, transcribing handwriting that is often difficult, organising documents that have no natural order, making decisions at every turn about what belongs together and what must be separated. The process is not merely clerical. It is editorial. Every choice about how to organise is a choice about how to present. Every decision about what gets transcribed first is a decision about what matters most. And these are decisions that Beatrice makes not as a scholar but as a daughter who loved her father, who understood his flaws, who believed in his greatness, and who is now solely responsible for determining which version of that flawed greatness the world will see. She is 42 years old when her mother dies. Her own children are growing. Her husband, John Waters, the man who survived Sidi Bouzid and the prison camps and the controversy of Task Force Baum, is pursuing his own army career with the quiet competence that has always characterized him. She's not a historian. She's not a writer. She's not a public figure. She is a private woman from a private family that happens to contain one of the most public men of the 20th century, and she has been handed the keys to his inner life. The weight of that responsibility shapes everything that follows. It shapes her relationship with biographers, who will come knocking in increasing numbers as the years pass. It shapes her relationship with the Library of Congress and other institutional archives that want the papers, that argue for their historical importance, that push for public access with the polite insistence of bureaucracies that believe all records ultimately belong to the nation. It shapes her relationship with her own siblings, with whom she must coordinate every decision about access and publication. And it shapes, most profoundly, her relationship with the truth about December 9th, that knot of unanswered questions she has carried since she was 34 years old, and a letter arrived from Heidelberg with her father's handwriting on the envelope, and his ghost already between the lines. She becomes the gatekeeper. The word implies something passive, someone who merely opens and closes a door. But Beatrice Waters is not passive. She is active in her guardianship, deliberate in her choices, strategic in her silences. She knows what the archive contains. She knows which documents are harmless and which are volatile. She knows where her father was cruel on the page, where he was brilliant, where he was prophetic, where he was merely petty. And she knows, because her mother told her, because she was there for parts of it, because the 12 days in Heidelberg left traces in the family consciousness that will never fully fade. She knows that somewhere in that archive, in the spaces between the official record and the private truth, lies a story about how George Patton died that has never been fully told. She does not tell it. Not yet. Perhaps not ever. But she holds it. And holding it becomes its own kind of power. The power of the woman who knows and chooses silence, whose silence is not ignorance but strategy, whose closed lips are themselves a statement about what the world deserves to hear and what it has not yet earned. The archive sits in its boxes. The diaries wait in their bindings. The letters rest in their folders. And Beatrice Patton Waters, daughter, wife, mother, gatekeeper, begins the long work of deciding what history will remember and what it will be forced to forget. But before there is any question of biographers or film producers, or the slow machinery of publication, there is the matter that sits at the centre of Beatrice's private reckoning like a stone in a closed fist. It is not her father's death. It is what her father did to save her husband's life, and what that attempt cost. March 1945. The war in Europe is entering its final bloody convulsion. Patton's Third Army has crossed the Rhine and is driving deep into the German heartland with a velocity that leaves even Bradley's planners scrambling to keep up with supply lines. The collapse of the Wehrmacht is no longer a question of whether but when, and in this moment of supreme military triumph, with history watching and the world's press cataloguing every advance, George Patton makes a decision that has nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with blood. He knows where John Waters is. He has known for weeks. Intelligence reports have confirmed that Oflastilthinthagst. B, a prisoner of war camp near the Bavarian town of Hammelburg, holds American officers, and among them, Lieutenant Colonel John Knight Waters, the husband of his eldest daughter. Waters has been a prisoner since February 1943, more than 2 years of captivity that began in the North African dust of Sidi Bou Zid and continued through a succession of German camps as the war ground forward without him. Beatrice has waited, the family has waited, and now, with Third Army forces roughly 50 miles from the camp, Patton decides he cannot wait for the natural advance to liberate it. He fears, he says later, that the Germans will massacre the prisoners as the front collapses. This is the reason he gives to anyone who asks. It is not an unreasonable fear. There have been reports of such atrocities, scattered and unconfirmed but plausible enough to justify concern. But it is also not the whole truth, and everyone in Patton's inner circle knows it. He wants his son-in-law back. He wants the man who married his Beatrice, the man who has suffered for 2 years in captivity while Patton commands armies, brought home alive, and he is willing to risk other men's lives to make it happen. Captain Abraham Baum receives the order. He is 24 years old, a combat veteran of considerable skill and no small amount of audacity, exactly the kind of officer Patton admires. Baum is to lead a task force of approximately 300 men and 54 vehicles, including 10 Sherman tanks, on a raid deep behind German lines, 50 miles through enemy territory, no flanking support, no reinforcement plan, a lightning strike to reach the camp, liberate the prisoners, and return before the Germans can organise a response. It is, by any conventional military assessment, a mission with an unacceptable risk-to-reward ratio. The distance is too great. The forces are too small. The intelligence on enemy dispositions along the route is incomplete. And Patton knows all of this. He orders it anyway. He also sends along Major Alexander Stiller, his personal aide, a man whose presence serves no tactical purpose whatsoever, but who knows John Waters by sight. Stiller is there to identify Patton's son-in-law, to make sure if the camp is reached that Waters is found. The inclusion of Stiller is the detail that makes Patton's later denials ring hollow. You do not send your personal aide on a suicide mission to identify a man you claim you are not specifically trying to rescue. Task Force Baum departs on March 26, 1945. For the first hours, momentum and surprise carry them forward. They punch through scattered German resistance, bypassing strongpoints, racing eastward with the desperate speed that such missions require. But 50 miles is a long way through hostile territory, and the Germans are not so broken that they cannot respond. Word spreads. Units converge. By the time Baum's column reaches the outskirts of Hammelburg on March 27, the element of surprise has long since evaporated. What Baum finds at Oflagthwytithund B compounds the disaster. He has been told to expect roughly 300 prisoners, a number his vehicles might conceivably transport back to American lines. Instead, 1,500 men pour out of the camp. As Baum later recalled, "I was elated by the fact that I got there. It was a miracle in itself, but I had understood that there were supposed to be 300 POWs, and outrun 1,500. That overwhelmed me. The mathematics of evacuation collapse instantly. There is no way to carry 1,500 men in 54 vehicles already loaded with ammunition and fuel, and there is no time to sort the problem, because German forces are closing from every direction." In the chaos of the attempted breakout, a German guard fires. The bullet strikes John Waters through the pelvis. He goes down in the camp yard, the liberation he has waited 2 years for turning in an instant into another wound, another captivity, another stretch of helplessness while events rage beyond his control. He will survive. But the injury is severe, permanent in its consequences, a thing he will carry in his body for the rest of his life. A daily physical reminder of his father-in-law's gamble. Task Force Baum is annihilated. Of the 300 men who set out, 32 are killed outright. Nearly all the rest are captured or wounded. The vehicles burn on German roads. Captain Baum himself is wounded and taken prisoner. Major Stiller is captured. The mission is, by every measurable standard, a catastrophe. One ordered not by military necessity but by personal desire wrapped in the language of operational concern. Patton denies it. He denies it immediately and continues denying it until his death 9 months later. He tells Omar Bradley it was a diversionary action. He tells his diary it was justified by the massacre threat. He tells anyone who will listen that he did not know Waters was at Hammelburg, a claim contradicted by his own intelligence summaries. The denial is instinctive and total, the response of a man who understands that what he has done crosses a line that no amount of battlefield genius can excuse. He has spent other men's lives, 32 of them permanently, for a private purpose, and he has failed. For Beatrice, the wound is layered in ways that no outsider can fully map. Her husband is shot. Her husband nearly dies. Her husband carries the pelvis injury for the rest of his life, a limp and a pain that never fully resolve. And this happened because her father, the man she adores, the man whose greatness she has never doubted, ordered it. He ordered it out of love for her, perhaps, out of love for Waters, out of some fierce Patton conviction that his family does not languish in captivity while he has tanks at his disposal. But he also ordered it out of arrogance, out of the same imperious certainty that makes him a great general and an impossible man. And 32 families received telegrams because of that certainty. Nearly 300 men were killed, wounded, or captured because George Patton could not bear to wait for the natural advance to free his son-in-law. This is the knowledge Beatrice carries into the archive room. This is the entry in the diary she reads with different eyes than any historian ever will. When she opens the pages from March 1945 and sees her father's handwriting recording his justifications, his rationalizations, his flat denials, she reads them as a woman whose husband still cannot walk without discomfort because of what those pages describe. She reads them as a daughter who must reconcile love with accountability, legend with consequence. And she reads them knowing that if the full story becomes public, it will not merely tarnish her father's reputation, it will define it. In a career of controversies, the slapping incidents, the anti-Soviet speeches, the command disputes, Task Force Baum is the one that carries the stain of something worse than bad judgment. It carries the stain of nepotism that killed. So when the historians come, when the biographers begin their approaches in the late 1950s and early 1960s, Beatrice already knows what she's protecting. It is not merely her father's glory. It is the family's private wound, the place where Patton's recklessness intersected with her own marriage, her own husband's body, her own children's father limping through their childhood because their grandfather could not leave well enough alone. Martin Blumenson arrives in her life during this period, a military historian of serious credentials and careful temperament, a man who understands that working with family papers requires diplomacy as much as scholarship. Blumenson is not the first to ask for access, but he is the one she trusts. He is the one she decides can be given the keys, or at least some of them. The arrangement takes shape over years. Blumenson receives access to the vast collection of letters, diaries, and official reports that Beatrice has maintained since her mother's death. He works methodically, a researcher of enormous patience, transcribing and annotating documents that span her father's entire life, from his childhood letters through West Point, through 2 world wars, through the bitter post-war months that ended in Heidelberg. The project will eventually produce 2 volumes, the Patton Papers, 1885-1940, and the Patton Papers, 1940-1945, published by Houghton Mifflin in 1972 and 1974. But the editorial process that produces those volumes is itself a story of negotiation, of boundary setting, of quiet but firm control, exercised by a woman who has spent 2 decades preparing for exactly this moment. The diaries are explosive. Beatrice knows this. Blumenson discovers it anew with each page. Patton's private voice is nothing like his public one, or rather, it is the public voice stripped of all restraint, all political calculation, all awareness of audience. In private, Patton is savage. His assessment of Eisenhower is withering. Putty in British hands, a political animal who has forgotten how to fight. Bradley fares little better, overly cautious, unimaginative, a man promoted beyond his ceiling. These opinions, committed to paper in the general's angular handwriting, would embarrass living men and their families if published without context or care. But it is the post-war entries that pose the gravest danger. Patton's administration of Bavaria in 1945 produces diary passages of breathtaking ugliness. His anti-Semitic remarks about Jewish displaced persons, comparing their treatment under his authority to Nazi policies, describing them in language that shocks even readers prepared for Patton's casual bigotries. These passages are not merely offensive, they are damning. They confirm the worst interpretations of the controversy that cost him his command, that reduced him from a conquering general to a military governor stripped of authority and shuffled into irrelevance. If published unedited, they would become the dominant story. Not the Rhine crossing, not the bulge, not the 30-day dash across France. The hatred, the smallness, the cruelty of a great man's private thoughts when he believed no one was listening. Beatrice navigates this terrain with a precision that reveals how thoroughly she understands the stakes. She does not refuse Blumenson access entirely. That would defeat the purpose of the project, which is to establish a scholarly record that she can control, rather than leaving the field open to unauthorized biographers working from rumor and second-hand sources. She does not demand a hagiography. She's too intelligent for that, too aware that a whitewash portrait would lack credibility and invite exactly the kind of adversarial investigation she hopes to preempt. Instead, she permits complexity. She allows Blumenson to publish material that shows her father as difficult, profane, volatile, contradictory. The resulting portrait is, as the Saturday Review notes upon publication, disturbing and absorbing, a multidimensional rendering of a man who was simultaneously brilliant and brutal, visionary and vain. But the published volumes are selective. They are curated. The process of selection, what Blumenson includes and what Beatrice quietly ensures remains in the family's possession, unpublished, constitutes her first major public act as an arbiter of historical memory. The most damaging passages are softened or omitted. The anti-Semitic entries appear in muted form, their worst edges filed down. The assessments of living figures are contextualized. And Task Force Baum, that most personal of all the archive's volatile contents, receives treatment that acknowledges the controversy without fully exposing the family's private wound. Blumenson, for his part, understands the arrangement. He is a professional. He knows that access comes with conditions, that working with a family archive means accepting the family's limits. He also knows, as he notes in his own reflections on the project, that Patton was a brilliant actor who played different roles for different audiences. The diaries capture one of those roles, perhaps the most honest, but not necessarily the most complete. There is room, in Blumenson's scholarly framework, for selective publication that serves history without betraying the trust that made the work possible. The 2 volumes appear, they are praised. They establish a foundation of primary source scholarship that every subsequent Patton biographer must engage with. And they serve Beatrice's purpose precisely. They give the world enough of her father's complexity to satisfy serious inquiry while keeping the most dangerous material under her control. The gate opens, but only part way. The gatekeeper decides how wide. Then Hollywood arrives, and the calculus shifts entirely. The film that becomes Patton has been gestating for nearly 20 years before it reaches theatres in 1970. The project's long gestation reflects in part the family's resistance. Beatrice and her siblings have spent years refusing cooperation with film producers, fearing that the kind of media attention a major motion picture would generate was precisely the force that had damaged their father during the war, had emboldened his enemies, amplified his missteps, and contributed, in the family's private accounting, to the chain of humiliations that ended on the Mannheim Road. The family's initial refusal leads the US Army itself to withhold official cooperation from the production, a significant obstacle for a film that requires military hardware, period accuracy, and the institutional credibility that Army endorsement provides. But Hollywood is patient, and money is persuasive, and eventually the production moves forward, with the family's grudging support, but without their full embrace. The screenplay, written by Francis Ford Coppola and Edmund H. North, draws on published sources, on Ladislas Farrago's earlier biography, on the growing body of Patton scholarship that the family's own cooperation with Blumenson has made possible. It does not require the family's private papers. It has enough public material to construct a narrative, and the narrative it constructs is something Beatrice could not have anticipated. A myth, George C. Scott's performance, the one he famously refuses the Academy Award for, creates a Patton who is larger than any archive. The opening scene alone, Scott standing before a massive American flag in full-dress uniform, delivering a profanity-laced address to unseen troops, becomes one of cinema's most iconic images. It is magnificent. It is also a simplification so powerful that it threatens to replace the man entirely. The film gives the world a Patton who is warrior poet, philosophical maverick, flawed genius, but never truly ugly, never truly small, never truly wrong in ways that matter. It omits his death. It sanitizes his views. It transforms the man who wrote those diary entries about Jewish refugees into a figure of almost romantic tragedy. For Beatrice, the film's success creates a paradox she will navigate for the remainder of her life. On one hand, it burnishes the legend beyond anything she could have achieved through selective publication alone. Her father becomes immortal in a way that transcends scholarship. He becomes a character in the global imagination, a name that even people who have never read a history book recognize and associate with martial greatness. The film protects the legacy by elevating it beyond reach of ordinary critique. On the other hand, it narrows the space in which truth can operate. The mythologized father on screen, Scott's Patton, Coppola's Patton, the pattern of that enormous flag, becomes the version the public knows, and any attempt to introduce complexity, to publish the harder material, to tell the fuller story, now must contend not merely with the family's own reluctance, but with an audience that has already decided who Patton was. The film makes the legend rigid. It gives the public a version they love, and loving it, they resist revision. Her grandson Robert will later recall that seeing the film as a child changed his understanding, revealed a cantankerous, difficult man behind the family's private knowledge. But for Beatrice herself, the effect is different. She watches her father become a fiction. She watches the documented man in her files, the man who wrote those diary entries, who ordered Task Force Baum, who told his wife from a hospital bed that the collision felt deliberate. She watches that man disappear behind George C. Scott's jaw and George C. Scott's voice and George C. Scott's magnificent award-refusing contempt for the machinery of celebrity. The real Patton, the Patton she holds in manila folders and leather-bound diaries, becomes harder to introduce to a world that already has the Patton it wants. And so, the archive's power shifts. Before the film, the papers are a source, the place where truth lives, waiting to be released at the gatekeeper's discretion. After the film, the papers become a counterweight, a corrective that the world may not want, that publishers may not find commercially viable, that the public may not be prepared to hear. Beatrice holds the truth about a man the world has decided it already knows, and the distance between what she holds and what the world believes grows wider with every screening, every revival, every time that opening monologue plays on late-night television, and another generation absorbs the legend without its shadows. She does not release the corrective. She does not publish the unedited diaries. She does not authorize a biography that tells the Task Force Baum story from the inside, from the wife's perspective, from the body of the man who took the bullet. She does not speak publicly about what her mother told her regarding December 9th. The gate remains where she set it, open enough for Blumeson's measured scholarship, closed against everything else. The film has not changed her strategy. It has only confirmed it. The world is not ready for the full archive. Perhaps it never will be. And so the boxes remain closed, the diaries wait in their bindings, and Beatrice Patton Waters continues the long guardianship, holding a truth that grows heavier with each year the legend hardens around it. Each year the questions about Mannheim go unasked. Each year the distance between the private man and the public myth becomes more difficult to bridge. The family's version of December 9th lives not in any single document, but in the accumulated weight of conversations held across decades. Remarks made at kitchen tables, observations shared between mother and daughter in the years before Beatrice Eyre Patton's death in 1953, and later careful repetitions offered to a small circle of trusted listeners who understood that what they were hearing carried the force of testimony, even if it would never enter a courtroom. The version is not a conspiracy theory. It is not a narrative of assassination, not yet. Not in the form Beatrice Patton Waters maintains it through the 1950s and 60s and into the 70s. It is something more restrained and, in its restraint, more damning, a catalogue of questions that were never asked, procedures that were never followed, and details that do not align. The truck. The family's account returns again and again to the truck. In the official record, the collision is simple geometry. A 2.5-ton army vehicle turning left into a quartermaster depot, crossing the path of Patton's Cadillac as it travelled in the opposite direction. A routine manoeuvre, poorly timed, but the family's version emphasises the behaviour of that truck in the moments before impact. The way it moved, the timing of its turn, the fact that it appeared to accelerate into the intersection rather than yield. Beatrice's mother, riding in a separate vehicle behind the Cadillac, had her own observations. Observations she shared with her daughter in the weeks and months after the funeral, observations that never appeared in any official document because no one from the investigation ever asked for them. The intersection itself, a crossing point where a military depot's entrance met a road carrying routine traffic between Mannheim and the headquarters at Bad Nauheim. The family noted that the site was not preserved. No measurements were taken of skid marks. No formal reconstruction of vehicle positions was attempted. The damaged Cadillac was not impounded as evidence. The truck was not held. In any civilian jurisdiction, in any police department operating under normal procedure, a collision that killed a general officer, that killed anyone, would have triggered a crime scene protocol. Photographs, measurements, witness separation and formal depositions. None of this occurred. The 818th Military Police arrived, took cursory statements, and produced a preliminary report that blamed carelessness on both drivers. Within days, the truck driver was exonerated. Within weeks, the original report vanished from military files. Beatrice carries this knowledge, not as accusation, but as absence. The absence of rigour, the absence of curiosity, the absence of the investigative machinery that should have engaged automatically when a 4-star general suffered fatal injuries on a controlled military road in occupied territory. She understood, because her mother understood, because her father had spent his career inside the institution, that the Army's failure to investigate was itself a statement. Either the institution was negligent to the point of criminal carelessness, simply indifferent to the death of its most famous commander, or someone somewhere in the chain of authority decided that a full investigation was not desirable, that the questions were better left unasked, that the official version, sparse and unsatisfying as it was, served someone's purpose. She does not say whom. She does not, in any recorded conversation from this period, point a finger at a specific office or individual. What she maintains, consistently, and with the precision of a woman trained from childhood in the language of military protocol, is that the handling of the scene was wrong, that it was insufficient, that it left her family without answers they were owed, and that the insufficiency was not accidental. The witness statements compound the problem. The driver of Patton's car, Private First Class Horace Woodring, gave one account. The truck driver, Technical Sergeant Robert L. Thompson, gave another. The General's aide, Major General Hobart Gay, offered a third. These accounts do not fully align, on speed, on distance, on the moment of awareness before impact. In a proper investigation, these discrepancies would have been explored, reconciled, or at least documented as contradictions requiring resolution. Instead, they were simply collected and filed, their inconsistencies left to fester in the historical record like wounds that never received treatment. Beatrice absorbs all of this, absorbs it as a daughter, as the wife of a man who already knows what it means to be sacrificed to her father's story, as a custodian who understands that what she holds in those archive boxes is not merely personal history, but evidence of institutional failure. She does not publish, she does not accuse, she does not grant interviews, but she knows, and she waits. And in her waiting, the questions she carries grow harder rather than easier to answer, because with each passing year, the witnesses age and die, the physical evidence disperses, and the institutional memory of that December morning grows thinner until all that remains is the family's version. Careful, specific, unanswered, and the Army's silence. Then, in October of 1979, a voice breaks through that silence from an unexpected direction, and it says something far more extreme than anything Beatrice has ever allowed herself to articulate. The setting is a banquet hall in Washington, D.C. The occasion is a dinner hosted by the Retired Intelligence Officers Association. The attendees are former spies, case officers, analysts, men who spent their careers in the shadow world of American covert operations. Among them sits Douglas Bazata, a former operative of the Office of Strategic Services, decorated for wartime valor, a man with a silver star and a purple heart, and a reputation that has curdled over the decades from heroism into bitterness. He is 70 years old, he has been drinking. And when he rises to speak, what emerges is not a toast or an anecdote, but a confession, or what he presents as one. Bazata claims that William Donovan, Wild Bill Donovan, the legendary director of the OSS, personally contracted him to kill General George S. Patton. He claims that he initiated the December 9th collision by staging the truck's movement into the Cadillac's path. He claims that when the crash failed to kill Patton outright, a subsequent attempt was made in the hospital. Poison, he says, administered during the 12 days of paralysis in Heidelberg. He offers details that shift with each telling: a low-velocity projectile, a rubber bullet, a device that disrupted the Cadillac's steering. The specifics are unstable, but the core assertion remains constant. He says he was paid. He says he did it. He says Donovan ordered it because Patton's post-war rhetoric, his anti-Soviet posturing, his public defiance of denazification policy, his open contempt for Eisenhower's diplomatic approach, made him a threat to the emerging architecture of Cold War cooperation. The room reacts with the complicated silence of men who have spent their lives evaluating credibility. Some dismiss Bazata immediately. A bitter old man seeking attention, a fabulist whose stories have grown taller with each year of irrelevance. Others note that he is saying this in front of witnesses at a formal gathering to an audience professionally equipped to assess intelligence claims. The story makes certain newspapers. It enters a particular stratum of American discourse, the stratum where Kennedy assassination theories live, where Watergate's revelations have taught a generation that official denials mean nothing, where the Church Committee hearings have demonstrated that the intelligence community is capable of exactly the kind of operation Bazata describes. Beatrice Patton Waters is 68 years old when Bazata speaks. She has spent 34 years guarding the family's version of December 9th. And now a stranger, a man she has never met, a man with no connection to her family, a man whose motives are opaque and whose credibility is contested, has taken the story she has carried privately and exploded it into the public sphere in its most extreme possible form. He has not said what she has said. He has not said the investigation was insufficient, that the scene was not preserved, that the witness statements conflict. He has said murder. He has said conspiracy. He has said the United States government killed her father. The claim arrives at a moment when competing theories are already circulating. The 1978 film Brass Target, a thriller loosely based on Frederick Nolan's novel The Dorado Briefing, had dramatized a fictionalized assassination plot against Patton, albeit one involving stolen Nazi gold rather than political silencing. That film planted the seed in popular culture. Now Bazata waters it with his public confession, and simultaneously, from a different direction entirely, researchers are exploring the possibility that Soviet intelligence, the NKVD, orchestrated the crash as retribution for Patton's anti-communist statements and his advocacy for rearming Germany against the Soviet Union. Beatrice finds herself caught between narratives, none of which she authored, none of which she controls. The family's careful, measured skepticism, the version that says the investigation was wrong, that the questions were not asked, that the handling of the scene was suspicious, now exists in a landscape cluttered with far more dramatic claims. Bazata says OSS, others say NKVD, the filmmakers say fiction but wink at truth. And all of them, everyone, are drawing from the same well of unanswered questions that the family identified decades earlier. The absence of investigation that Beatrice has quietly noted for 34 years has become the vacuum into which every theory rushes. She does not endorse Bazata. She does not embrace his claim. Those who spoke with her privately in this period report a woman deeply skeptical of the man's credibility, a woman who recognized, with the instinct of a lifetime's gatekeeping, that Bazata's story was too neat, too self-aggrandizing, too conveniently timed to the cultural moment of conspiracy enthusiasm. His account, she understood, bore the hallmarks of what critics would later call unsubstantiated, uncontrollable, bitter and revengeful fabrication. The testimony of a man who wanted to matter, who wanted to have been at the centre of history, who wanted the world to know his name for something larger than a silver star earned in a war that ended 34 years prior. But neither does she deny the underlying premise entirely. Because the underlying premise, that someone may have wanted Patton dead, that the accident may not have been accidental, that the failure to investigate served a purpose, is the premise her family has carried since December of 1945. Bazata's version is grotesque, theatrical, almost certainly false in its specifics. But the question beneath it, the question of why no one investigated, is the question Beatrice has been asking all along, and Bazata's public spectacle, for all its unreliability, ensures that the question will never fully disappear from public consciousness. The conspiracy theorists, wrong as they may be in their answers, are asking the right question, and that question is the one Beatrice has guarded in her silence. She takes no public position. She issues no statement. She grants no interviews about Bazata, or about the NKVD theories, or about Brass Target, or about any of the speculation that now swirls around her father's death. the gate remains where she set it. But the pressure against that gate has intensified enormously, because now it is not merely scholars and biographers who want access to the archive. It is conspiracy theorists, journalists pursuing sensational angles, documentary producers who smell ratings in the assassination narrative. The researchers at the door multiply through the 1980s, and each one arrives with a different theory, a different angle, a different reason why the Patton Papers must be opened. Martin Blumenson's 2-volume work, The Patton Papers, published in 1972 and 74, remains the only authorized scholarly access to the archive. Blumenson was granted what Beatrice considered appropriate, a curated selection, extensive but not complete, shaped by her judgment about what served the historical record and what did not. The resulting publication is monumental, thousands of pages of diary entries, letters, operational documents, and yet it is also, by design, incomplete. Blumenson himself acknowledged the constraints. He worked within boundaries the family set. He published what he was given permission to publish, and what he omitted, the most incendiary diary passages, the most personal correspondence, the documents touching directly on the crash and its aftermath, remained in the family's possession under Beatrice's authority. Now, in the 80s, others want what Blumenson was denied, biographers seeking fresh material for new assessments of Patton's generalship, historians investigating the post-war occupation and Patton's controversial management of denazification, journalists pursuing the assassination angle that Bezzata's claims have renewed. Each approaches Beatrice with requests, credentials, proposals. Each encounters a woman who is not passive, not overwhelmed, not uncertain about what she holds or what it means. She is a deliberate negotiator. She understands the market for her father's legacy, understands that what sits in those boxes has monetary value, scholarly value, cultural value, and above all, narrative power. She understands that releasing a document is an irreversible act, that once a diary entry enters the public record, it cannot be recalled, cannot be recontextualized, cannot be explained away. Her reasoning, when she offers it, centers on 2 pillars. The first is reputation, her father's, her family's, the institution's. Certain documents contain material that would damage all 3. The diary entries about Jewish refugees, the private correspondence revealing the depth of Patton's post-war political resentments, the operational documents that make Task Force Baum legible as what it was, a personal rescue mission that cost 32 lives. These are not documents that serve the legend. They are documents that complicate it, that humanize the monument into something fragile and flawed, that give ammunition to those who would diminish rather than understand. The second pillar is privacy. The claim that these papers belong to the family, that their contents are personal, that the public has no automatic right to the interior life of a man simply because he was famous. This argument carries legal weight. The papers are private property, not government documents, and Beatrice deploys it with precision. She is not hiding history, she maintains. She is protecting the boundary between the public figure and the private man. The world received the general. The family keeps the father, the husband, the flawed human being whose unguarded words were never meant for strangers. Researchers leave empty-handed. Some accept the refusal gracefully, acknowledging the family's prerogative. Others push back, arguing that Patton's significance to American military history creates an obligation of disclosure that transcends personal ownership. Beatrice is unmoved. She has watched what happens when her father's words enter the public sphere without her curation, watched Bezzata weaponize the unanswered questions, watched filmmakers reshape the man into entertainment, watched journalists reduce complexity to headline. She will not feed that machinery. She will not provide the raw material for others to construct narratives she cannot control. And beneath both stated reasons, reputation and privacy, lies the third, unstated reason that only those closest to her fully appreciate. The archive contains the family's version of December 9th. It contains what her mother told her. It contains whatever documentary traces exist of the questions that were never officially asked. And releasing those materials would do one of 2 things, neither of which Beatrice finds acceptable. Either the documents would be dismissed, treated as the paranoid speculation of a grieving family, insufficient to prove anything, easily explained away by historians committed to the accidental death narrative, or they would be seized upon, amplified by the conspiracy theorists, merged with Bezzata's fantasies and the NKVD theories, transformed into fuel for exactly the kind of sensationalist narrative that degrades rather than honours her father's memory. There is no middle path. There is no audience prepared to receive the family's careful, measured scepticism on its own terms. To sit with the questions without demanding answers, to acknowledge the investigative failures without leaping to assassination. The world wants either accident or murder. The family holds something more honest and more difficult: doubt. And doubt, Beatrice understands, does not survive contact with the public. It will be simplified, distorted, claimed by partisans on every side. So the gate holds, the boxes remain closed. The researchers are turned away with courteous firmness and ironclad legal standing. And Beatrice Patton Waters, now in her 70s, continues the vigil she began at 34, holding a truth that is not quite a truth, a suspicion that is not quite an accusation, a silence that speaks louder than any of the voices clamouring outside her door. But the gate, however firmly held, guards only one side of the road. Through the 1980s, a parallel archive begins to assemble itself, not in Beatrice's study, not under her control, but in federal reading rooms and declassification queues where no family prerogative can reach. The Freedom of Information Act, signed into law in 1966 and strengthened by amendment in 1974, has by now generated an entire bureaucratic ecosystem of request, review, and release. Historians, journalists, and amateur researchers file FOIA petitions with the Army, with the Central Intelligence Agency, successor to the OSS, with the National Archives and Records Administration. And slowly, in batches that follow no narrative logic, documents surface. Army Criminal Investigation Division files from the European theatre appear in declassified batches. Signal intercepts from December 1945, routine traffic monitoring of Allied communications in the occupation zone, enter the public record. OSS operational files, long sealed under national security classification, begin their phased release as the Cold War thaws and the agencies that generated them see diminishing reason to protect 50-year-old secrets. None of these documents arrive with context. None come packaged as a coherent story. They are fragments, a memorandum here, a routing slip there, a personnel roster that places certain individuals in certain locations on certain dates. But fragments, in the hands of determined researchers, become bricks, and bricks, stacked with sufficient ingenuity, become walls that either support or collapse existing structures. Some of what emerges corroborates the official account in ways that should, in principle, settle questions. Signal traffic from the Mannheim area on December 9th shows no anomalous military movement, no unexplained vehicle repositioning, no communication pattern suggesting a coordinated action. The CID files that survive, partial because the original accident report by Lieutenant Peter Babelas remains missing, contain witness statements consistent with a low-speed collision caused by inattention. Robert L. Thompson, the truck driver, appears in personnel records as exactly what the official account describes: a quartermaster technician returning from a routine supply run, not an operative, not a plant, not a man with unusual training or suspicious connections. His service record is banal in its completeness. There is no gap where a covert assignment might hide, but other documents raise questions that the official narrative never anticipated having to answer. Road traffic logs from the Mannheim-Heidelberg corridor show that Patton's route on December the 9th was known in advance, communicated through standard staff channels to military police units responsible for route security. The general's movements were not secret. They were, in the parlance of occupation-era protocol, flagged for awareness. This means that anyone with access to those channels, and in the chaotic administrative structure of post-war Germany, access was loosely controlled, could have known where Patton's car would be, and roughly when. The logs do not prove malice, they prove opportunity. And opportunity, in the absence of a proper investigation, is precisely the kind of fact that feeds both legitimate inquiry and paranoid speculation in equal measure. For Beatrice, this shift in the evidentiary landscape arrives as a slow erosion rather than a single shock. No one document breaks the dam. No single release forces her hand. But the cumulative effect is unmistakable. She is no longer the sole custodian of the Patton story. The archive she controls, the diaries, the personal letters, the family's private account of December 9th, now exists in relationship to a growing body of publicly accessible material that anyone can read, anyone can interpret, anyone can weaponize. The researchers who once came to her door seeking access now arrive already armed with declassified fragments, asking not to see the archive but to confirm or deny whether the family's private documents align with what the government has released. The questions are more specific, the pressure more informed. The gap between what is publicly known and what she privately holds grows simultaneously more visible and more difficult to justify. She watches from a careful distance as the declassified materials generate a new wave of publication. Books appear, not the careful scholarly work of a Martin Blumenson, whose access she curated and whose conclusions she could influence, but speculative investigations by authors she has never met, working entirely from public documents and unnamed sources. Some cite the Bazata claims alongside the newly available OSS files, constructing narratives that blend verified operational history with unverifiable allegation. Others dismiss the conspiracy theories but note, with increasing pointedness, that the Army's failure to convene a proper investigation board remains unexplained, that the cursory nature of the original inquiry looks worse, not better, in light of what the declassified record reveals about standard protocol for incidents involving general officers. The family's position hardens in response. Beatrice's grandson, James Patton Totten, will later articulate what becomes the definitive family rebuttal, that Beatrice Eyre Patton, the general's widow, not the daughter, hired private investigators in the years after the crash, and that those investigators found nothing to substantiate rumours of foul play. This statement, offered decades later, carries the weight of family authority. It also carries an implicit admission. The family took the question seriously enough to investigate. They did not dismiss the doubts. They pursued them privately, through channels they controlled, and arrived at a conclusion they found sufficient. Whether that conclusion rested on exhaustive evidence, or on the limits of what private detectives could uncover in occupied Germany, where witnesses had scattered, where military records were already disappearing, where the Cold War was rapidly reclassifying anything touching intelligence operations, remains unknowable. The investigation happened. Its methods and findings were never made public. Its conclusion, nothing substantiated, became the family's final word. But final words, Beatrice understands, are only final if no new evidence appears. And the declassification cycles of the 80s and 90s ensure that evidence, or what can be construed as evidence, will continue appearing long after she is gone. The archive she holds is no longer a sealed vault in a world of silence. It is one voice among many, and its authority derives increasingly not from what it contains but from what it withholds. This is the position from which Beatrice makes her last and most consequential decision. The papers must go somewhere. She is aging. The physical collection, boxes of diaries, folders of correspondence, maps marked in her father's hand, photographs annotated on their backs, requires institutional preservation that a private home cannot guarantee indefinitely. Fire, flood, the entropy of heirs who may not share her vigilance. Any of these could destroy what she has spent decades protecting. The logical destination is the Library of Congress, whose manuscript division already holds the papers of dozens of military figures, whose archivists possess the expertise to preserve fragile documents, and whose institutional prestige confers a kind of official sanction on whatever collection it receives. A donation to the Library of Congress says, "This is the record. This is what matters. This is what the nation should have." And so the collection travels to Washington. It arrives in stages, some materials donated during Beatrice's lifetime, others bequeathed through the family after her death. The Patton papers, as they become known to researchers, form a substantial archive. Diaries, correspondence, operational documents, personal reflections spanning decades of military service. The collection is rich, detailed, and by any measure invaluable to scholars of the Second World War and the American military tradition. It is also to those who examine it with care incomplete. The original diaries, handwritten in Patton's distinctive script, end on March 24th, 1945. The final 9 months of his life, from the last weeks of the European war through the occupation, the demotion, the growing political isolation, and the crash itself, exist only as annotated transcripts. These transcripts were prepared by the family, by the widow and her helpers, in the years after the general's death, as part of the work that produced the posthumous memoir, War as I Knew It. They are not forgeries. They are not fabrications, but they are mediated documents, copies filtered through familial judgment about what to include, what to summarize, what to silently omit. The original diary volumes covering April through early December 1945, the months when Patton wrote most explosively about his political enemies, about the occupation policies he despised, about the Soviet threat he believed America was ignoring, and possibly about the growing sense of personal danger he confided to intimates, are not in the collection. They are not in any public collection. They have never surfaced at auction, in a private sale, or in the possession of any institution. They are simply absent. Researchers notice. Archivists note the gap in their finding aids. Scholars who work extensively with the collection observe that the correspondence too shows patterns of selection. Letters referenced in other documents, letters whose existence is confirmed by replies that survive, are sometimes missing from the folders where they should reside. The absences are not random. They cluster around sensitive subjects, the post-war political controversies, the personal relationships that would embarrass, and, most tantalizingly, the period immediately surrounding December 9th. There are no smoking guns in what remains because whatever smoke existed has been removed along with the gun that produced it. This is Beatrice's final act of curation, not destruction, or at least not provably destruction, since no one can demonstrate that documents once existed if the only evidence of their existence has also been removed. But selection, a deliberate, irreversible choice about what the historical record will contain and what it will lack. She does not burn the archive. She does not refuse to donate. She gives generously, thousands of pages, decades of material, enough to sustain scholarly careers and fill published volumes. But she gives selectively. She gives the general. She keeps the father. She gives the war. She keeps December 9th. And in doing so, she creates something more powerful than either disclosure or silence alone could achieve. She creates an absence with a shape, a hole in the record that is itself a kind of testimony, not to what happened on that road outside Mannheim, but to the family's conviction that what happened mattered enough to protect. The missing diaries do not prove assassination. They do not prove accident. They prove only that someone who held them believed their contents were too dangerous, too easily misused, too vulnerable to the machinery of public interpretation, to be released. They prove that Beatrice made a choice, and that she made it knowing it could never be undone. She chose silence over distortion. She chose the integrity of doubt over the corruption of certainty. She understood, with a clarity born of decades watching her father's words twisted by admirers and detractors alike, that the truth of December 9th, whatever it was, could not survive translation into public discourse. It would become entertainment. It would become conspiracy. It would become ammunition for people who never knew the man and never loved him, and never sat with the weight of not knowing. So she kept it, held it close, let it die with the people who carried it. Beatrice Patton Waters dies on October 24th, 1993, in South Hamilton, Massachusetts. She is 82 years old. She has outlived her father by nearly half a century. She has outlived her mother, who died in 1953. She has outlived the era in which a family could reasonably expect to control the narrative of a public figure through private custody of documents. The world she leaves behind is one of FOIA requests and declassification schedules and digital reproduction, a world in which archives are searchable and absences are noticeable, and silence itself becomes a subject of inquiry. She leaves behind a collection at the Library of Congress that will serve scholars for generations. She leaves behind gaps in that collection that will fuel speculation for just as long. She never makes a definitive public statement about the crash. She never confirms or denies the family's private suspicions. She never releases whatever documentary evidence the family's own investigation produced or failed to produce. She never gives the conspiracy theorist what they want. She never gives the historians what they want. She never gives anyone the satisfaction of a clean answer, because she does not possess a clean answer, and she refuses to manufacture one in either direction. What December 9th is still owed, what the historical record cannot provide and what no future declassification will supply, is a conclusion. The army never investigated properly. The family investigated privately and announced no findings. The original accident report vanished. The truck driver was exonerated without a board of inquiry. The witnesses gave inconsistent accounts that were never reconciled under oath. The man who claimed responsibility, Douglas Bazzata, was an unreliable self-aggrandizer whose testimony would not survive 5 minutes of cross-examination. The Soviet theories rest on no documentary evidence from Russian archives, which have partially opened since 1991 without producing a single corroborating document. The missing diary pages could contain anything or nothing. The family's silence could mask knowledge or simply reflect the absence of knowledge, the honest, painful condition of not knowing. The record, as it stands in the 21st century, supports exactly one conclusion: that the circumstances of George S. Patton's death were never adequately examined by the institution responsible for his safety, and that this failure of examination, whether born of negligence, embarrassment, or something darker, created a vacuum that speculation has filled for 8 decades. The vacuum is the story. Not murder, not accident. The vacuum, and the last letter, written from Heidelberg on December 5, 1945, 4 days before the collision, sits in the collection at the Library of Congress. It is one of the documents Beatrice chose to make public. Its closing lines are legible in Patton's hand, the pen strokes of a man who did not yet know he had 4 days left to live, who was planning his return to the United States, who was thinking of his daughter and his grandchildren, and the life he expected to resume. I may see you before you see this. The letter arrived after the telegram, after the phone call, after the 12 days of paralysis, and the death in a hospital room in Heidelberg, and the burial in Luxembourg among the men of Third Army. Beatrice received it knowing her father was already in the ground. She read those words, "I may see you before you see this," and understood them as the last communication from a man who sensed, perhaps, that the world was closing around him, who felt the velocity of something approaching, who wrote to his eldest daughter not a warning, not an accusation, not a confession, but a simple statement of anticipation that became, in the aftermath, something far heavier than he intended. She kept the letter. She released the letter. She let the world have those words. And everything else. The doubts, the questions, the family's private reckoning with a death that never added up. She held in the silence where it belonged. Not the silence of ignorance, not the silence of indifference. The silence of a woman who loved her father, who could not prove what she suspected, and who decided that the dignity of not knowing was preferable to the degradation of being disbelieved. The gate closed. The boxes were sorted. The collection went to Washington, shaped by her hand, and the rest went with her into the quiet ground of Massachusetts, where Pattons have always returned, where the questions need no answers, where a daughter's loyalty outlasts every archive ever built.